Sí, hablo en inglés como ayer por dos razones. La primera razón es que es un poco más fácil para mí. Y la segunda razón es que una cosa muy importante en el mundo de hoy es la capacidad de comunicar a través de las fronteras. Y para comunicar con los chineses o los indios o los rusos, es importante aprender un lenguaje común, una lengua franca. Esta lengua franca, por razones no fundamentales, contingentes, es ahora y será el inglés. So I'll carry on. I realize I'm talking in the context of an Institute of Legal Studies in institution of that is based on law, and for that reason I'll certainly finish with something a bit more precise about the legal form, which the theme I'm going to address, so the theme of Ingreso básico, the legal form it should take. I should say that from my own legal studies, when I studied law, the course I followed, which I preferred, is one in which there was an important historical dimension. That is, before presenting the law as it was, the professor went back in history. And I found that very interesting, not because I'm particularly interested in archives in the past, but because I'm interested in the future. And looking at the past enables you to see how contingent the current legislation is, how it changed, why it changed, and indeed how it can change and why it must change in the future. And so therefore, in my presentation today, I'll also start with some historical overview around the theme that interests us in order to shed light on the present situation and indeed on the potential for the future. Before doing all that, I'm also an analytical philosopher, and I'll start with a definition so that things are clear about what I'm going to talk about. And so the book that was just published in Spanish under the title Ingreso básico is about something that now is mainly named in the world basic income. It has many other names. Even in Spanish it has two names, renta básica, which is most common in Spain, and ingreso básico, which is most common in Latin America. But it has, even in Spanish, it has more names than that. And what is this basic income, this ingreso básico? Well, it's an income that is paid in an unconditional way. And I have to specify immediately in what sense it is unconditional. Because it is unconditional in the sense in which many existing schemes are already unconditional. For example, many existing schemes of social assistance, and I'll turn to the notion of social assistance in a minute, but so schemes of the sort that you know here in Mexico in the form of initially what was called Progreso, later Oportunidades, and now Prospera. These schemes are already unconditional in the sense that they are given in cash, in efectivo. So they are unconditional in the sense that they are not given in the form of food or in the form of a right to housing. They are cash. There is no condition imposed on what you do with that money. Also, existing schemes of that sort, and I presume also in Mexico, are not strictly restricted to the nationals of the country. So it's also extended to legal residents who are not citizens of the country. That's certainly the case in similar schemes that exist elsewhere in the world, and I'm not quite sure about the the situation of Prospera here. So if you are a legal resident, you are entitled to it, possibly with after a certain number of years. That will also be the case for basic income. And it is also unconditional as Prospero is, in the sense that it's extended to people who have not contributed to any social insurance scheme in the past. They haven't paid social contributions. But in addition to the three unconditionalities which already exist in many existing schemes, there are three more unconditionalities which are really what defines a basic income. One, it is strictly individual. That means that the amount you get or your right to it doesn't depend on your family situation, on your household situation. Whether you live on your own or you live with one or more people, you are entitled to it, and the amount is exactly the same. Okay, that's the first difference. So there is no reason to come and check with whom you live in order to determine your entitlement. The second additional unconditionality, specific unconditionality for a basic income, is that it's not means tested. That is, it is in the term that's often used to refer to this unconditionality is that it's universal. It's independent of any income from another source. It's paid to you whether you are rich or poor. No reason to come and check whether you have income from your savings, income from your work as a self-employed or as a wage worker. You get it if you are unemployed, but if you find a job, you still get it, right? That's the second specific unconditionality. And the third one is that it's obligation-free. It's obligation-free in the sense that, in the limited sense that you are not meant to, in the sense that you are not supposed, in order to be entitled to it, not supposed to work or be available for work. So if you choose to quit a job voluntarily, you are still entitled to it. If you decide to spend your time looking after your children, or being a student, or just breathing before doing something else, you are entitled to it. So in this sense, it's obligation-free. There is, in existing schemes, such as Prospera, you have some obligation, if you have children, to have some checkups, health checkups, or to send them to schools. You can have this sort of obligation in the case of the basic income that is given for a child. And so the child benefits can be subjected to this sort of benefits, but it's not an essential part of the definition of a basic income. So to sum up, what is a basic income? It's a non-conditional basic income in these three specific senses. It's strictly individual. There is no means test, no income test, and there is no work test in the sense that I've just specified. That's the definition. And now let's sort of look back in history and take a bit of a long-term perspective. That will be very useful to address the question which is in the title that was announced, which is how do we fit basic income within the existing schemes of social protection? Well, you could say that there are three basic forms of social protection, or social protection may not be the best expression to denote the sort of the whole set of these proposals, but you could call that material security, as opposed to sheer physical security and safety against violence, etc. But material security is the security in terms of the income, the means you have in order to conduct your existence. Well, there are three basic forms, three basic models of material security in this form. Material security provided by public authorities. The first one, the oldest one, was born at the beginning of the 16th century. Some people want to trace it back to Thomas More's Utopia. Thomas More's Utopia was published in 1516, beginning of the 16th century. And there is indeed a very short suggestion of something that could be interpreted as social assistance. But it's not in his description of the island of Utopia. There's a lot of false, including in the basic income movement, a false attribution of even the idea of basic income to Thomas More, to Thomas More's Utopia. In his description of the island of Utopia, there is nothing resembling a basic income. But that description is only in part 2 of this wonderful little book, Utopia, which is the description of the island of Utopia. But in chapter 1, there is, in part 1, there is a report on what the traveler, the bloke who went to Utopia, to the island of Utopia, also traveled in England, and he reports a number of things. So Thomas More puts in his mouth a number of things, including very critical comments about the level of inequality and the abuse of power in England at the time. And there's one interesting passage which suggests that Thomas More was one of the very first ones to think seriously about some sort of guaranteed minimum income. It's a discussion about the question of why there are more murders, more people being murdered in England than in France. And he's speaking with the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he says, look, this is not surprising at all, because there is something you do in England which is very, very silly. If someone is caught stealing, the punishment is capital punishment. People are condemned to death if they are caught stealing. And this is very silly, because if you are stealing and someone sees you, what do? You kill the person who sees you, because if you are caught stealing, you'll be killed, you'll be executed. If you murder someone, you'll also be executed. But if you murder the person who's seen you stealing, the probability of being caught will be less, and therefore the probability of being executed will be less. So it's just sheer rational thinking that explains why you silly Brits have so many murders. It's just because you give the same punishment to stealing and to murdering, right? You have to differentiate that. And he says then, and that's a crucial passage, he said, in fact, if you want to reduce stealing, there is something far more intelligent you could do, which is to give everyone, the Latin word is proventus vitae, and so that is enough sustenance for people's livelihood. It's not very clear from that passage whether this livelihood should be got through work. It's suggested further in the book that it should be through a sort of revival of the economy, or whether it should be given in the form of some sort of social assistance, so that everyone would get enough to eat, so not to be forced to steal. And a friend of Thomas More's, someone called Juan Luis Vives, born in Valencia, then who later taught at the University of Louvain. He was a converso who had to flee Spain at the time of the Inquisition because his Jewish origin family was being persecuted. And so he left Spain forever when he was 17. And he published a little book, and he tells one of his friends, he stays with Thomas More in London for a while. He writes to one of his friends, I'm writing a little book, but I don't even dare to tell you what the title is and what the content is, for fear that it would fall in bad hands. This little book was published in 1526, 10 years after Utopia in Antwerp, under the title De Subventione Pauperum, on the assistance to the poor. And this is the first plea for social assistance, for the public help to the poor, so that the poor people would be assisted by their municipalities. Why was that so subversive that he was even fearing that it would fall in the bad hands. Why was one of the first little cities, Ypres in Flanders, that implemented the scheme, taken to the religious court, to the theologians of the Sorbonne in Paris, being accused of heresy? It is because they were accused of doing something that was against the doctrine of the church, because these municipalities wanted to ban begging in the streets, but in exchange to have the municipalities, not just private charity or the religious orders, provide a secure income to every single individual. And this was defended at the same time by Luther in Germany. So it was the beginning of the Protestant movement about exactly 500 years ago. And therefore this was regarded as highly subversive. So this was the first implementation of something totally utopian for many centuries, which says that the public authorities should regard it as their duty to help the poor. This then took many forms in the course of history. In fact, it quickly generalized at the end of the 16th century and then throughout the following centuries in England, which was then the most developed and the part of the world that was industrializing then gradually at an increasing pace, and that were the famous poor laws that governed this aspect of British English, and then later more broadly British life for several centuries. So it was in all parishes there was a responsibility on the part of the civil authorities to help the poor. This system got then into a very deep crisis at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, because I mentioned that also yesterday. There was the deep crisis described very powerfully and denounced very powerfully by Thomas Malthus, the founder of so-called Malthusianism, and it's closely related to its population policy associated to Malthusianism. It's closely related to his critique, very fierce critique of the poor laws. Say the more you help the poor, the more poor there will be. The more poor persons there will be. Both because you trap them in poverty, because you give them an income. You provide them an income and help only if they remain poor. As soon as they are no longer, they start working, you say, oh, sorry, now you are entitled to nothing. And secondly, because you enable these people to keep procreating and to make more poor little kids who will become poor people later in life, etc. As I said, the poor laws are an absolute disaster. This is not going to make the poor rich, it's going to make all the rich poor because you'll need to draw more and more resources. And there was a consensus among great intellectuals at the time. Ricardo, one of the founders of modern economics, said, let's go back to private charity. Hegel, the German philosophers, let's go back to private charity. Tocqueville, the great analyst of both French and American society, said, let's go back to private charity. This is a disaster. What saved it? What saved it? And I say it saved it because social assistance still exists, and Prospera here is an example, Bolsa Familia, and you have social assistance schemes in all developed countries. But what saved it is that there was another model, profoundly different, that was first concocted by a philosopher at the end of the 18th century and then implemented for all sorts of reasons, mainly bad reasons, but it was a very good idea, all the same, in Germany at the end of the 19th century. And this radically different model of material security, of social protection, is social insurance, or what is sometimes called social security in a narrow sense. What was this idea? And so Condorcet, a philosopher, mathematician at the end of the 18th century, one of the main thinkers in the French Revolution, but contributed to many domains of knowledge as well, said, well, you know, there's something that could be done using the probability calculus, which is this. Why don't all people, especially all workers, put aside a little bit of money that will cover themselves in case they get sick? They don't know in advance whether they'll get sick, but they'll, in case they get sick, they get some money so that they can survive. And so that it's a sort of subsidy that is given not out of charity, but out of self-interest by the healthy people to the sick people. And it's not out of charity, but out of self-interest, because it's part of an insurance system. Everyone pays, but you don't know in advance whether you'll be sick. And so the unlucky one will be the lucky ones. That is, the people who are unlucky because they are sick are lucky because they are those who will receive the subsidies that are paid by the healthy people. And the same holds for the dead subsidizing the survivors. Old age pension, that's what it is. So you put some money aside, and if the risk obtains, that is, you become old, you are unlucky enough to become old, then the generous dead people have been paying throughout their life, or their active life, in order to pay a pension for you. That's the idea. Nothing to do with charity to the poor, but just insurance. The people who each pay their little contribution year after year, they create a fund so that they are covered in case some risks obtain, like sickness, invalidity, accidents, old age, and then later extended to other cases like involuntary unemployment as the economy became more and more formal. That idea is present in this book, which Condorcet wrote while he was hiding just next to the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris. He was hiding there for a year, and then one day, because he would have been guillotined, executed had he been spotted at the time, then he finally came out of that house, was walked miles and miles, and somewhere in the countryside he was imprisoned, was put in jail one evening. The following morning he was found dead, and no one knows how he died, but he probably had a poison which he always carried with him in order not to be guillotined. He preferred to take the poison himself. Anyway, he was a great mind, and he was the first to concoct this second revolutionary utopian model of material protection, which doesn't rely on this charity to the poor. It's not targeted to the poor. It's really solidarity among the workers. It took a long while for it to become reality. It became reality when Bismarck, at the end of the 19th century, thought, there is there a nasty movement taking shape, inspired by, no doubt, a great thinker, but a rather dangerous thinker called Karl Marx. And there is a workers' movement getting stronger and stronger that is trying to challenge the wealth and the power of the elite in Prussia and elsewhere in German-speaking countries, which Bismarck was trying to unify. And then he thought, I have a clever idea. I'll create a pension system organized by the Reich, by the state, with the collaboration of the representatives of the employers and the workers. I'll organize that, and I'll organize that at the level of the Reich, of the new Germany I'm trying to create. Until then, Germany was not a country. There was a set of duchies, Principal of Freistaat, Bayern, Schleswig-Holstein, all these things, which had never been together within a single state. Prussia, with Berlin as its capital, where Bismarck was, wanted to unify all that. And this clever Bismarck thought, not a very nice guy, judging by the pictures we have of him, but but both because of the threat of these workers mobilizing against the privileged, and because of finding a trick in order to get an allegiance to this new state that was emerging, he said, and he thought he had to negotiate, it was a hard negotiation and totally new in the history of mankind to do something. And he created these pensions for all workers in the whole of Germany, from Bayern to Schleswig-Holstein, were entitled to a small pension. It was not very big for a large part of the workers. It was only 17% of their last wage. It was something completely new, that you would get some income after a working life. You would get some income after you stop working from a certain age. Something so restricted to formal workers at a time when in Germany, like elsewhere, most workers were agricultural workers in the informal sector. It was extended. It was not just pensions. It was also invalidity, sickness, and that was the very first system of social insurance. Because many people said this will be a catastrophe, economic, it will be unsustainable, unpayable. Other people said, that was on the right, let's say, on the left, people said, oh, this is imagined by Bismarck, so it's certainly a very bad idea coming from a guy like that. Or they said, this is trying to buy off the workers and tame their revolutionary spirit. But it happened, and then people said, well, it works, and the workers like it. And then it was expanded in Germany, it was copied in France, it was copied in England, it was copied in Belgium, it was copied in other, and it was copied today in the whole of the world. Throughout the world you have this social security, and in many countries, not in all, not in this country, but in many countries, the bulk of the so-called welfare state, the bulk of social protection, of material security, is not through aid to the poor, but through this solidarity between workers. Okay? In the countries where this grew, there was a hope. For example, Jean Jaurès, the leader of the French socialists, was assassinated, a pacifist, assassinated just before the First World War. He thought that he had to fight within his party, because some people in his party said, no, the future is the extension and of social assistance to everyone. That is the future, because it covers everyone, not just the workers in the formal sector. But Jaurès thought, no, what we must do is, in fact, increase the formal sector so that more and more people could get insured, and eventually we can get rid completely of this discredited aid to the poor, which is a form of charity, because in the case of this solidarity, it's a right of the workers to be covered in the case of risk, in old age, in sickness, etc., because it's their right, because they contribute to it as part of an insurance scheme. As it turned out, it did expand considerably, to the point of being in this country, in France, being the bulk, or countries like my country, Belgium, or in Germany, it's really the bulk of the financial mass involved in redistribution takes the form of social insurance, solidarity between workers, and the social assistance is residual. In other countries, there is far more, in Brazil, for example, there is far more in the Bolsa Familia, which is a social assistance scheme, than there is in the social insurance for the formal workers. So it depends on the strength and the size, the scope of the formal sector. Okay, but what certainly didn't happen is a total disappearance on it of social assistance, a total replacement. So social assistance was saved from this very serious crisis it went through in the countries in which it was most developed in the 19th century. It was saved by the emergence of social insurance, but it didn't disappear. Indeed, in developed countries, it's gaining more and more importance as social insurance is losing its strong grip, as more and more of the economic activity no longer takes the form of stable wage work throughout one's life. And so France, for example, which thought it could dispense with it, introduced later than many other countries, 1988, what was then called the Revenu Minimum d'Insertion, which initially they thought it would be residual, but quickly there were 2 million French people in a population of somewhat over 50 million that were dependent on this Revenu Minimum d'Insertion. So the budget was far higher than what was expected, and the number of people had to rely on it was also very large. Now the name has changed, but the population covered keeps increasing. Italy, which was the last of the developed countries in Europe, the richer countries in Europe that didn't have such a scheme, is introducing one in January next year, Revenu Reddito di Inclusione Sociale, at a lower level in some other countries, but precisely because they realize that they'll need this in a permanent way, because so many people are not covered by social insurance or not sufficiently covered and fall into poverty. There's a patchwork of very incomplete schemes at the moment, and they are unifying that into something more general. So that's the background. So far, my historical survey, I have said nothing about basic income itself, but it's essential to understand this past and the existence of these two models. What we have today is, in fact, because basic income. I'll explain in a minute a bit more why. But basic income has been getting in recent years, in recent months. Certainly extremely popular. It was a sort of rather marginal idea defended by a few academics and a few activists, a few civil servants also in a number of countries, but it's only recently that there are millions of people who have become aware of the idea, hundreds of thousands of people who are advocating in an active way. And, but at the same time, it's being resisted for reasons analogous to the resistance to the first two models. Because I mentioned when social assistance was introduced and the public intervention in help to the poor, it was strongly resisted by some parts of the Christian establishment of the church that fought against it, including through the court, through the religious court at the time. Later, when social insurance was introduced, there were also people, and were interesting debates, who said, as I just mentioned, no, this is not the way forward. There are all these dépôts de mendicité, as it was called, or the poor houses also in Britain that had their own administration, and the people involved in it wanted to protect it, and some with good reasons. What I just mentioned, the people who said, no, with your new scheme, you'll only cover the privileged workers. In fact, we need something that covers the whole population. And there was a strong resistance on the part of the people who were used to the previous model. Similarly today, and so now that in European countries, the biggest model, the biggest part is this social insurance system that is often managed by the trade unions. Trade unions often are extremely opposed to not all of them, but on the whole, they are either, in the best case, indifferent, but in many cases very hostile to this idea of a third model, but for reasons that are partly analogous to the opposition to the introduction of the other two models. So, basic income, so where does the idea come from, and does it exist? Has it been implemented anywhere in the world? Well, the idea is usually traced to a little pamphlet that was completely forgotten, in fact, until the birth of the Basic Income Network. It's one of my friends and colleagues, Hilaire Stenier, who is a professor, Canadian professor at the University of Manchester, who is a sort of left libertarian, who drew my attention in the 1980s when I started thinking about the idea. He said, well, have you ever had a look at this thing which he used in his doctoral thesis, a little pamphlet by Thomas Paine, an Englishman who was very active in the French and the American Revolution. And in 1796, in the winter from 1796 to 1997, he was a close friend of Condorcet as well. He wrote this little pamphlet called Agrarian Justice. And the basic idea was that ethically speaking, morally speaking, we are all the co-owners, the joint owners of the earth, of land. But this land has been privately appropriated by rich people on the whole. And this is not right. This is unjust, that they should derive all the benefits from the ownership of land. And so what you should do is assess the value of land, the rental value of land, what it's worth, and distribute the yield of this rent. You can do that through some fund, creation of some fund, but essentially the value, the rental value of all this land, of all the natural resources, should be distributed as a dividend to every member of the society concerned. He didn't propose a basic income in the sense of a regular income throughout life. What he proposed is that every man or woman aged 21 should receive a little endowment funded in this way. And then from age 50, which was very old at the time, given the life expectancy, everyone would receive a little basic pension. Most of the funding would go to this pension. It was essentially a basic pension plus a little endowment at the beginning of each person's life. There was another chap called, a bit confusingly, Thomas Spence, also an Englishman, who initially from Newcastle, he moved to London. He was an activist, fiery activist, and initially a school teacher. And he hated Thomas Paine, no doubt in part because Thomas Paine was very famous. He wrote these bestsellers of the time, which didn't make him very rich, but Common Sense and The Rights of Man. And so these two big books that played an important role in the American Revolution against England, against his own country. So he was hated also by the establishment, but he was hated by this Thomas Spence, who was more radical than him. He found that this idea of Paine was far too stingy. And so he said, in fact, you shouldn't only tax the land, unimproved land, but all real estate. So all the houses and the factories, everything should be taxed at the level of each parish. So of course some parishes are very poor, don't have very much. So the rental value of all real estate, land or what's on it, should be distributed as a dividend to everyone. And then he claims this would be an amount that would be far richer, and there are some extravagant claims he makes about how the whole economy would revive, etc. It's a bit of a naive argument. Paine was a more cautious thinker, but and the first formulation of a real basic income we found is in this very short pamphlet called The Rights of Infants, in which he proposed that each parish should have a system of this sort. He also has other weird but interesting ideas, like the idea that every parish should be run by women only. The women should be the bosses of each place, and at the same time, there should be this basic income. The first proposal of a basic income at the level of a whole of a country was made in 1848. I mentioned that yesterday also. In Brussels, to my great surprise, because it's only many years after I had started thinking about basic income that some British researcher found 4 books by the same author in the Royal Library in Brussels that defended that idea that 1848, so same year as Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto also in Brussels, this man published a book called Solution of the Social Problem, Solution du Problème Social, in which he proposes a territorial dividend, same sort of argument as Paine and Spence, but at the level of the whole of the country. Said, but restricted, he says, to the indigène, to the indigenous population. So the immigrants would only be entitled to it fully in the 3rd generation. So there is a long waiting period for the people coming from elsewhere, but it was the first formulation. We've never seen anyone quoting these books. There is a letter which was found in the archives of the Belgian Socialist Party, where he writes shortly before the end of his life, 50 years after the first book, he writes to the rector of the University of Brussels, saying, look, I've sent you a copy of my previous book. You didn't send me back indicating that you received it. So I'm sending you a shorter version of my ideas. I hope you'll read it this time. Probably never read it. And I remain convinced that this is the only rational solution to the social problem. So I give this, so this was the first formulation of basic income at the level of a country, never quoted by anyone. Has it been read by anyone? No one knows. So it's the sort of really little, like a little seed that fell on completely barren soil, right? Like sowing in the desert or something. And occasionally, so in the course of years, you had a few people proposing something like that. There is an endorsement, brief endorsement of the idea in John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy, etc. The first real debate on basic income happened after the First World War in England. It was even under the name state bonus submitted to an annual conference of the Labour Party in Britain, but rejected. It kept living with some important intellectuals, including James Meade, not to be confused with one of the current Mexican politicians, right? James Meade proposed it, became later a Nobel laureate in economics, and throughout his life, up to in the late 90s, but he started in 1930s, defending that idea under the name social dividend. And at the end of his life, he still wrote a little book called Agathotopia, in which basic income, social dividend is a central notion. So it kept living in this way, but it was a marginal part of his work. Then there was, again, a public debate, brief but interesting, in the late 60s, early 70s, in the United States. And so it's often associated with Milton Friedman's proposal of a negative income tax in his book, Capitalism and Freedom, 1962. He was not the inventor of that notion. That notion goes back to Cournot, a French economist in the 19th century, one of the founders of mathematical economics, but certainly Friedman popularized it, but it was a negative income tax, which is really a refundable tax credit, a reduction in taxation, but which can be paid in full or in part to the people who have low incomes. So it remains targeted to the poor in some sense, but it has some similarities with basic income. There is no work test involved in his proposal. But in the late 60s and then early 70s, the basic income as such was proposed under the name Demogrant. The main people behind it were James Tobin, also later Nobel laureate, best known now for his Tobin tax, but he defended that, and John Kenneth Galbraith, famous economist, author of best-selling Affluent Society, etc. His book, Affluent Society, is interesting. We quote that in our book because there are two editions of it. In the first one, he says, well, of course, the best solution to address poverty would be this guaranteed minimum income, but unfortunately, it's not feasible. And then 10 years later, he writes another version of, new edition of the same book. The text is identical up to that point. And then he said the rational solution is this. And now it has become possible, and this is the way we should go. And in between, late 60s, so turbulent 60s, early 70s, the mood had changed in the United States. And Galbraith and Tobin managed to convince George McGovern to put it as a central element in his program for the primaries, which he won as the candidate for the Democratic Party. Then it was so much criticized, ridiculed by the idea of giving, it was $1,000 per year to every American. It was quite a lot of money at the time. That was Tobin's proposal and the name Demogrant, that he dropped it for the presidential election itself against Nixon, which he lost disastrously for reasons, also unrelated. I don't think that had he kept the idea, he would have won the election, but he had dropped it by then. But it gave then, there was some discussion far beyond academic circles at the time, thanks to that. The contemporary debate really only started then in 1980, starting in Europe, in Holland, in Denmark, there was some discussion. We created this international network in 1986, initially as a European network, then more and more people came from outside Europe. Today it's a worldwide network called BIEN, Basic Income Earth Network, and with national sections from Taiwan to Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Mexico, etc. So it's but initially, so it was spreading information without much happening in terms of pressure, lobbying on, or what happened was rather discreet. But it was propelled so recently to center stage in a number of countries, and for a number of contingent reasons, but which all reveal something going on underlying it. A few examples: there was a national referendum in Switzerland last year in June, and so in Switzerland you have direct democracy, several referendums every year. If there are 100,000 Swiss citizens who sign a request to organize a referendum, the Swiss authorities are obliged to organize it. This happened for the introduction of an unconditional basic income. If the referendum is won, if there is a majority of the population, of the voters, in favor of it, and a majority of the cantons in which a majority of the voters, 26 cantons in Switzerland, if there is a majority of the cantons in which a majority of the voters have voted in favor of it, then the content of the proposal becomes part of the Swiss constitution. So it's a very strong, it has a very strong power. And the text said the Swiss Confederation introduced an unconditional basic income. The level must be sufficient to enable Swiss people to have a dignified life and participate in public life. And the level of it and the way of funding will be determined by law, by the legislator. And it was defeated. 77% against 23%. Part of the defeat and the problem, in fact, with the proposal is that although no amount was mentioned in the text itself, the initiators of the popular initiative, and so leading to the referendum, were forced to say, well, what does it mean, an amount sufficient, etc. And they said 2,500 Swiss francs per month and per person. That is $2,500 per month and per person, in 1/4 of that for every child. Quite a big amount, even in Switzerland. It's about 39% of GDP per capita. They had pretty fanciful suggestions about how to fund it. The most precise one was an increase in VAT, which is now 8% in Switzerland. And under their proposal, it would have gone from 8% to 66%. And even that was on the very optimistic assumptions about the impact of their proposal, because at the same time they said, well, I have a nice T-shirt they gave me. I took part in a debate there in Zurich and Geneva, and with all the things you could do once you have these 2,500 Swiss francs a month, so you can spend more time in your garden, look after your children, do further training, be an activist in your community. Yes, but then you say, well, won't that reduce GDP in Switzerland if many people do all these things? And then instead of needing 39% of GDP, and because GDP shrinks, then it may be 52% of GDP you need once people will have adjusted. And so they were very nice people. They were essentially, so the initiators said, well, it's essentially ein Kulturimpuls, a cultural impulse. We want people to, but the economics of it was frankly very weak. Very nice people, very important debate. no population in the world was more informed about basic income, had thought more about it than the Swiss population, and it led to the idea being taken more seriously elsewhere. There was a long article in the Wall Street Journal saying, oh, even the Swiss are thinking of this crazy idea, there must be something going on. So this was one important element, but there were a number of other elements that helped trigger the debate. One of them is that the socialist candidate for the socialist primary, the presidential primary in France, Benoît Hamon, made it his central proposal. This was even bolder than McGovern. It was not just one proposal among many, it was his central proposal, Revenu Universel, a real unconditional basic income. To my surprise, he came first in the first round of the primary. To my surprise, again, he won the second round and became the official candidate. He ran against the previous prime minister, Hollande's prime minister, Valls, and won against it, strongly supported by the young people. Then again, for the presidential election, he did something similar to McGovern. He watered down his proposal. He took on board as his advisors Thomas Piketty and Thomas Piketty's wife Julia Cagé, and that turned it into a negative income tax proposal without calling it a negative income tax proposal, because it doesn't sound very good if you defend a negative income tax proposal, right? People don't like that because it sounds like Milton Friedman, and for a socialist to defend that, it would have... but that's what they were proposing, but then trying to explain that this revenu universel, this universal basic income, would mean in fact less taxation, not more taxation, which is what they tried to explain. So it became extremely confused. Like McGovern, Benoît Hamon lost disastrously in the first round of the presidential election itself, but again, for reasons that were largely unrelated. I think in this case, the confusion didn't help him, but most people in the first round were thinking, who should we vote for, who would have the greatest chance to beat Marianne Le Pen and the National Front in the final round. And that's why there was a lot of strategic voting, and people who would have voted socialist but then voted for Macron, the current president, or voted for Mélenchon, who is a sort of left-wing populist, who wasn't more traditional left-wing and wasn't supporting basic income at all. And the third element in the European context is that in Finland, the right-of-center government decided to the current prime minister there is insisting on the importance of evidence-based policy. You introduce policies once you've tested them, and pushed by the young section in his party, to a large extent also by the opposition, because the parties that have been proposing for decennia now in Finland, proposing basic income, are the Greens and the Left Alliance, which is to the left of the Socialist Party, not the Socialist Party, not the Social Democrats. Well, pushed by those, they decided to have a so-called basic income experiment. And so there are 2,000 people now, and for 2 years, who are told, look, you keep receiving you benefit, like sort of Prospera type benefits, which are given currently to in a very conditional way. So people receive these benefits only if they are poor. It's not individual, and they are supposed to keep showing they are seeking a job and they are looking for a job. 2,000 of these 150,000 people were told, now you keep receiving this amount, but you can combine it with income from other sources. There is no means test. Okay, you can add income from work, and we are no longer going to push you in order to apply, force you to accept a job if one is offered. We let you free, so no work test. So in this sense, these people receive something you can regard as a basic income. And so there is, for 2 years, these people are being watched. So what do they do? At the end of the 2 years, will there more of them with a job than in the rest of the 150,000, more or less? Do they take more training? Do they just decide to keep looking after their children? Is there a difference between the behavior of men and women in this group? This is what is being tested. And so, again, as a result of that, you have a lot of fake news about that. You have these headings saying Finland is introducing a basic income. The first time the news reached our private national television channel in Belgium, I was phoned by a journalist to say, we need to talk to you urgently. Can we come and interview you this evening about the fact that Finland is introducing a basic income? I said, you can come and interview me, but Finland is not introducing a basic income. And so they came in the evening, they interviewed me for 10 minutes, and then in the evening you had 2 minutes on Finland where you saw a Father Christmas arriving on a sledge in the snow with all sorts of presents, and saying they did qualify their statement. They say they didn't say Finland is introducing has introduced a basic income. They said Finland will introduce a basic income. But how do we know that? And then there was a vague definition of a basic income, and then 3 sentences which I had said in the interview, but which said about the contrary of what I said if you had taken the whole interview together. So you have a lot of fake news, but again, these 3 events and then fed and the spreading of the idea, the dissemination of this idea. And then worldwide, you had a different sort of impact because a number of people have been making these prognoses about the effects of automation, robotization, artificial intelligence, about jobs, about the disappearing of jobs, and the fact that machines will replace not just our hands but our brains, and that you'll have there are all, again, these sensationalist statements about saying, well, there are 3 million truck drivers in the United States, so people driving trucks, and they said in 10 years' time all these trucks will be driven by computers. So there will be these 3,000 people who have their own skills. They can drive, but they can also do all sorts of other things which they need to do with them. There will be jobless. So as a result of the spreading of some of speculations about these effects, a number of people, including some pundits and big bosses in Silicon Valley, later Mark Zuckerberg and Richard Branson, and so big shots in the world of business, and Musk also said, so in public statements, Mark Zuckerberg, when he got a honorary degree at Harvard, his alma mater, in his speech to the students at the annual event, graduation ceremony, said, so we need to, can't remember the exact phrasing, but we need to take seriously the idea of universal basic income. And so suddenly all sorts of people who thought this is just the idea of a few lunatics like Pablo, like me, and suddenly thought, well, this must be, after all, there may be something in it. So much of the argument is again very flimsy or superficial, and so you can't just infer from these simple forecasts about the real disappearance of jobs. And so before, you can see the number of jobs and caring jobs of all sorts. I don't think that's the right argument, but there is something fundamental happening, and then this leads me to my conclusion, which is that what is the fundamental reasons why you have these various things, what I just mentioned in the last years? Well, it has to do with technical change, and it has to do with globalization, and the combination of these things has led to an explosion in each of the countries, although in a sense that doesn't hold worldwide if you take the world as a whole, but in each country to a polarization of earning power, that some people as a result of this double process, so globalization and a specific sort of labor-saving technical change, some people have been able to earn far more than similar people earned in the past. And the people who own a lot of capital, who earn intellectual property rights, or who have skills which are very lucrative on this world market given the existing technology. So these people see their earning power explode, enormous. But at the same time, lots of people see themselves, with the skills they have, see themselves in competition with other people worldwide. And moreover, displaced in a number of jobs which they had, or the risk at being displaced, with the result that their earning power, or their reliable earning power, because many may still have a wage that's above the poverty line, but that has become more vulnerable, more fragile than before, and more precarious. And so there are more and more people of that sort. So there is this growing inequality, this growing polarization between the gainers, the winners of technological change and globalization, and the losers. It plays itself out in different ways in different countries, but there is a phenomenon of this sort worldwide. And what basic income does is not just for all the people at the bottom, then try to give them a social assistance, because they fall out of the social insurance system just to keep them alive, with the risk of trapping them there forever in that situation of poverty, because for reasons which I briefly alluded to but instead the basic income provides a floor on which people can stand, and that it can be supplemented with income from other sources. It's easily combinable with training, further education throughout lifelong education. It's easily combinable with slowing down when you need to slow down, just in order to avoid a burnout, and then in the end, in order to be able to work longer in your life, or in order to look better after your kids at the time they need it, which will make it better for you and better for your kids, etc. That's what a basic income does essentially. And it's become more popular because people are aware of these growing inequalities and growing precariousness. In some countries, growing unemployment. In other countries, there's not more unemployment, but far more precariousness, part-time jobs, multi-empleo, more self-employment. In France, self-employment has grown twice as fast as waged employment in the last decade, which is etc. etc. You have all that, and the old remedy, which consisted in saying we just need more growth, and that will give more jobs to more people, and having jobs will enable them to pay social security contributions that will cover them through the social insurance system. This old strategy no longer works. The hope that growth will solve the problem no longer works, because people have first realized more than 30 years ago, when people like me started thinking about this idea that continuous growth is a big problem. We didn't know about climate change. People realized that continuous growth may not be possible, even if desirable. There's this whole new theme of secular stagnation. And then in most countries, we've had this growth in the last 30 years, or since the golden 60s. We are much richer on average than the golden 60s. But the rate of precariousness and unemployment has not gone down. It has increased. And so you need something else, and that gives far more plausibility, credibility to a radical alternative, to thinking out of the box and thinking, well, after all, yes, there may be a different model. But, and this is for me essential, so you fit this floor under the whole distribution of income, but this is not a full substitution for the previous two models of social protection. Just as the second model has not replaced the first one, it has saved the first one by enabling it to keep playing an important residual role. Similarly, you have to see the modest flow. Initially, in all countries, it will be pretty modest, 10%, 15% of GDP per capita. But then people who are on social insurance, who who get an earnings-related pension will receive a top-up. So the level of their pension will not be fully replaced by the basic income. Basic income will give them a non-conditional floor, and they will keep a top-up that will remain conditional, related to what they earned and the social security contributions they paid. Even in the case of social assistance, if some people, for example, because they are invalid or live on their own and are handicapped, they receive from a social assistance scheme more than the basic income, this will not be scrapped. It's just that part of it they receive unconditionally, and then the rest will remain subjected to some tests, some more or less intrusive. There will be some control. But what basic income does is then help these other systems, social insurance and social assistance, to function better rather than scrap them altogether. And when evaluating proposal, including, and so I just watched last night also this speech by, what's he called, Anania, the leader of PAN or of the Frente Ciudadano, who said our central proposal in matter of social policy is a universal basic income. Well, then some people may say, well, this comes from a rather suspicious side. Isn't it a bad idea coming from a guy with that? Not necessarily. It depends on what exactly. It doesn't only depend on the level that is being proposed. That was left unspecified. It says it can be funded, etc. So it will be a level that's modest. But you have to see above all what it is meant to replace. And of course, a basic income should not. I just said it shouldn't replace the whole of social insurance, not even the whole of social assistance. Certainly, if it remains a modest level, but it should certainly not replace the need for a good functioning education system, free and of sufficient quality for everyone to a certain age, and a healthcare package that is accessible for everyone and of sufficiently good quality. And so basic income is not a replacement for that. It's not a replacement for quality public spaces and other public goods that must be provided to people. But basic income, it's also very crucial not to see that as simply a consumption sort of way of giving purchasing people for people to consume. It's an investment for society. It's an investment for society because it's a better tool against poverty, and kids growing up in poverty, that's a terrible waste of human resources for a society because of the lasting handicaps they'll have. And kids who are not properly fed, who are not, and even if they go to school and even if some health care is provided, I mean, the fight against poverty itself, the reduction in poverty through a better system, being universal with a better rate of take-up among the poor, it's an investment in this sense, but it's also an investment because basic income facilitates and gets rid or reduces the poverty trap. So it enables these people who are in a situation of poverty to get out of it through getting a job, through getting a job that gives them more training and more prospects in the future, through facilitating this thing that is essential for our economies today, which is lifelong learning in a very supple and very subtle, flexible way. So it's an investment in this sense. I just finished by asking, turning to the question of what should be the legal status of a basic income ladder. Should it be constitutionalized in particular? Certainly it should be made, when it's introduced, it should be made a right. It's not it would not be at the discretion of each municipality to decide whether a person is entitled to it. Everyone would be entitled to it. Should it be something like a fundamental right? Some people defend basic income as being a human right and following from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a confusion. I believe that you cannot base a defense on, of basic income, of an unconditional basic income, on what is present in the Universal Declaration. So I believe have towards the human rights that sometimes offends some of my friends, lawyers, but I've always found the notion of human right at the same time politically very important and powerful as a tool, but philosophically very woolly and unsatisfactory. And so having a list of human rights is really very... But so I don't find it a philosophically interesting concept, but it is important as a tool in order to get progress in a number of contexts. But the connection between the human rights, including the human rights to decent existence, which the social dimension which you have in the Declaration, from that you cannot derive the justification of basic income. When you do that, there is a confusion because between an unconditional right to an income and a right to an unconditional income. I repeat, and there is a difference between an unconditional right to a sufficient income and a right to an unconditional income. Because nothing in that declaration says that you should give this, whatever income is required to get out of poverty, nothing says that you should give it on an individual basis without taking into account the economies of scale that happens in households when more people live together. Nothing in that phrasing says that you should give it in a universal way, giving to the rich as well as to the poor. That's nothing like that is present in the formulation there. And nothing, more crucially, but perhaps more controversially, nothing says there that you have to give an income even to the people who could easily work and find a job and simply refuse to work. So none of the three specific unconditionalities can be derived from the formulation of the social rights that are incorporated in the Universal Declaration. That doesn't make it absurd to fight for giving a legal status to that thing and for introducing policies, but I don't personally attach a great importance to putting the notion of an unconditional basic income in a constitutional text, and that would be more difficult to change, and because it would be a right on paper, because there will be, as rightly pointed out by Fabiola yesterday, in the philosophical discussion, there will always be difficult trade-offs to be made by political authorities, by parliaments, between the quality of public services, which should also be unconditional, like healthcare and education on the one hand, and then cash income that is given to people. I repeat, the cash income is not just, it's also an investment that helps people's health, and helps people's education. So it shouldn't be regarded as being opposed to each other, but there will be these difficult trade-offs that are policy trade-offs, not matters of fundamental rights. So one shouldn't have an absolute priority plus what is a decent income, a sufficient income. All this would be anyway too vague in order to give a strong. But my lawyer friends usually disagree with that, and some of them disagree with that, and some of you may disagree with it too. So that's what I wanted to give by way of food for thought. Thank you.
Entonces, si alguien quisiera hacer alguna pregunta o tuviera algún comentario en relación con esta, sobre todo aquellos que tienen mucho, ¿no? Esta última parte me parece que es muy provocativa para... No veo a algunos de mis favoritos humanistas aquí, pero no sé, o alguna aclaración, alguna profundización. Alejandro, por favor. Gracias, profesor. Una breve presentación les pido, por favor, para que el doctor tenga una referencia sobre ustedes.
Gracias. Gracias, buenos días. Alejandro Montiel, académico del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas. Yo tengo una pregunta que nace de una preocupación. Yo puedo decir que las políticas basadas en preceptos keynesianos me dan miedo. Y partiendo de lo anterior, yo soy hayekiano.
Yo soy
hayekiano.
Okay.
Hayek.
Sí.
Y en este sentido, hago dos preguntas. Número uno, ¿Cómo? Es renta básica universal. ¿Cómo? Económicamente, las medidas serían incrementando la oferta monetaria, estableciendo nuevas políticas tributarias, lo cual viene a ser lo que Marx también combatió del lado, y no soy marxista, pero combatió del lado, no, pero porque llega una determinación, permítame, llega una deducción similar. Los mecanismos de apropiación de los cuales hablaba Marx, que el capitalista establece, también podemos verlos dentro del gobierno, dentro de las políticas estatales. Entonces, para obtener los recursos, ¿cómo? Políticas monetarias, lo cual se traduce en inflación, el incremento de políticas tributarias, de impuestos, lo cual significa mecanismos de apropiación gubernamental, y en un escenario mexicano donde los derechos de propiedad ni constitucionalmente se encuentran delimitados en gran medida, bueno, por no decir que no se encuentran limitados, pues, ¿quiénes van a pagar ese costo de la renta básica universal? Esta es una pregunta que preocupa. Por otra parte, ¿cómo hacer compatible lo que, y esto es lo que digo de Marx, es mecanismo de apropiación? Y entonces…
Mecanismo de producción.
Apropiación.
Apropiación.
Appropriation.
Sí.
Y aquí, ¿cómo podría ser compatible la noción de renta básica universal con lo que, de una manera mal interpretada del propio Keynes, de Hayek y de Friedman? Tampoco soy santo, soy devoto de ese señor, pero ¿cómo podríamos hacer compatible el llamado salario de complementariedad o la renta subsidiaria, de la cual habla Hayek en Derecho, Legislación y Libertad? ¿No sería más viable hablar de este punto que de la renta básica universal? Salario de complementariedad significa otorgar de manera adicional a aquellas personas que no alcanzan el mínimo para la subsistencia, y lo cual sería ya establecer a personas que se encuentran activas dentro del proceso de intercambio de producción, y no solamente fomentar la capacidad ociosa o profundizar la capacidad ociosa que programas como Oportunidades han establecido, han provocado. Entonces, esa es la pregunta. ¿Cómo? ¿Por medio de qué políticas económicas? Monetaria, fiscal. Y en segundo lugar, ¿cómo compatibilizar la renta básica universal con la renta subsidiaria o de subsistencia? Complementariedad. Gracias.
Pero la renta subsidiaria es una expresión usada por…
La renta subsidiaria…
¿Usada por Hayek?
Friedrich Hayek. En Derecho, Legislación y Libertad. Friedrich Hayek.
¿En qué artículo? ¿En qué libro?
Derecho, Law, Legislation and Liberty.
Sí, ok.
Y The Constitution of Liberty.
Sí.
En estos aspectos lo habla. Y yo quiero preguntar, ¿cómo se hace compatible?
Sí, sí.
Gracias.
Ok.
Shall we go one to one, or do we like go around
Okay,
and then
okay.
just
Okay.
Buen día, me llamo Javier, soy investigador del Centro de Estudios Constitucionales de la Corte. La pregunta que tengo es la siguiente. En un mundo profundamente atravesado por migraciones transnacionales, ¿cuáles piensas que deben ser los límites de la comunidad política que reciba este beneficio?
Okay.
Yo soy Camilo Saavedra, también trabajo en el Centro de Estudios Constitucionales de la Suprema Corte. Me interesó mucho lo que decías al final sobre el tema de derechos humanos frente a la renta básica. Creo que pasa mucho que el discurso de los derechos humanos parece muy exitoso para defender muchas cuestiones hoy en día, el medio ambiente, otras cuestiones. Y mi pregunta tiene que ver con En tu experiencia, en tu conocimiento, digamos, por lo que ha hecho la red bien, ¿dónde ha sido más exitoso, dónde se discute mejor el tema de la renta básica? ¿Cuando se pone como una cuestión asociada a un derecho humano o en un contexto más de políticas públicas?
Bueno, va a darme la palabra. Yo también quiero hacer una breve pregunta sobre las condiciones a las que te referías cuando decías, bueno, hay un momento que se está o se ha ido generando, ¿no?, para que el discurso de la renta básica empiece a extenderse, ¿no? Y es la desigualdad, la generación de una mayor iniquidad en el ingreso, ¿no? Y uno de los aspectos que creo que está ahí es, efectivamente, ha habido una transferencia muy importante, no solamente por efectos de la globalización, pero también por efectos de la regulación, de ingreso del trabajo hacia ingreso del capital. Y entonces, bueno, esto ha hecho que el ingreso del trabajo se vuelva mucho más vulnerable en términos no solamente de capacidad adquisitiva, sino también de poder prever, verse con seguridad en el trabajo. Dejando a un lado el tema tecnológico, me quiero centrar en el tema regulatorio. Porque a mí me parece que el tema de la renta básica enfrenta una tensión con la capacidad regulatoria del Estado. Si avanzamos en la dirección de una renta básica, que yo estaría de acuerdo en avanzar, pero no sellamos primero, no fortalecemos primero las capacidades regulatorias de los estados. Claro, la renta básica es un ejercicio de ingreso que se va a llevar a cabo fundamentalmente a través de relaciones de mercado. No importa si el consumo de la vida material se va a dar en relaciones de mercado. Si los mercados están tan inequitativamente regulados que el capital obtiene unas muy importantes rentas de la relación de mercado, ¿no?, puede ser que la renta básica acabe volviéndose paradójicamente, un poco el argumento de Hirschman del típico argumento de Rhetoric of Reaction, ¿no?, de Albert Hirschman, the book of
¿Qué argumento?
No, in the Rhetoric of Reaction, no, these arguments of having the opposite effect in terms of generating more accumulation on the part of the capital instead of really making a more equal society. Or at least there would be an uneven distribution of this universal income. At the end of the in a short time, there will be a reallocation of this income that will go to this capital accumulation, unless you have much better regulated markets. That in the case of Mexico would be an example.
Okay.
¿Hay alguien más que quiera?
Okay, good questions. Hayek first. I have personally great admiration for Hayek. I think it's an extremely insightful thinker, and indeed, I discovered, in fact, not so long ago, two texts, including one that we quote in the epilogue of our book, which is his vibrant plea for utopia, where he says we need, 1949, we need a liberal utopia, otherwise the socialists will keep winning. And the reason why the socialists kept winning at that time, he said, is that they were bold enough to defend the utopia. And I think he's fundamentally right on that. He's also fundamentally right, and that's related to Pablo's question already, that there is in 1939, long before the European Union was created, there's an article by him called the Preconditions of Interstate Federalism, which is a vibrant plea for something that looks very much like the European Union today. And why is it such a good thing? For two reasons. One is that because of the single market, the national states are unable to interfere with the economy, to regulate and redistribute because of the mobility and the so-called four freedoms of the single market. First reason. And this is combined with the fact that because of the heterogeneity of the federation, both in terms of economic situations and in terms of identities. It will be politically impossible to do at the level of the Union what is it will be politically impossible to do at the level of the Union what has become economically impossible at the level of each of the states, both in terms of distribution and in terms of regulation. And I mean, it's wonderfully insightful. He says, therefore, there is a strong alliance between creating these multinational federations. It's different from a national federation, but because of the heterogeneity, there is an alliance between that and what he calls the liberal project, which is what we call today neoliberalism. But that's not an answer to you two questions. It's already part of an answer to Pablo's. But on your first question, and so I think you can indeed think in principle about two ways of funding basic income. In fact, three ways. One consists in saying, well, we'll just create money. No? That's the first possibility. Two, you say we tax some people. It doesn't need to be personal income taxation. It can be other forms. And there is a third possibility that you may have when you have natural resources, which is to create either to redistribute immediately the yield of the sales of what you currently exploit, or do what Alaska did, which is to create a fund out of the exploitation of petrol, and then this fund is invested in a diversified way worldwide, and you pay a dividend out of this fund. But the fund was created thanks to the natural resources. So there you don't have taxation and you don't have money creation either, okay? So you have these three possibilities, but you concentrated on the first two. You said the first two are bad. I agree with you on the first one. Funding of basic income through money creation, which is occasionally proposed, is silly. With one qualification, there was a big, serious debate in Europe around the idea of quantitative easing for the people. And what was that? It's when there was a need to kickstart the European economy, the European Central Bank proceeded, as one usually does in this case, through the private banking system by reducing interest rates and so on. But it didn't produce very much. Many people said, you shouldn't have done it this way. But the way you should have done is give 500 euros to every citizen in the Eurozone, every resident in the Eurozone. Not enough, give another 500 euros to the thing. The problem is that you didn't have the pipelines to do that. If you had an EU-wide basic income, you could have put more money in the pipeline at that moment. And that's, of course, when you want inflation, when there is not enough inflation. But you can't do that forever, and you can't do that to fund a stable basic income. So I agree with you in excluding inflation. I don't agree with you with excluding taxation. I think, of course, what you do with taxation, in fact, Hammond was the governor, the Republican governor of Alaska, who introduced the scheme there, said, this dividend, Alaska dividend, some people say it's socialism, but it's the opposite of socialism, because this is collective wealth, which we give to the individuals. And we say it's not for the government to spend it, it's for the individuals to spend it. So it's exactly, socialism take the money from the individuals and for the state to spend it. Here is the collectivity, which has this money, it belongs to Alaska, and is given to the people, and then the people decide what to do with it. And I believe that taxation, in general, not only the natural resources, is it's an illusion to believe that the rich people really own rightly the big incomes they have. Most of them is the product of the incredible circumstances in which there are all these public goods, social capital in a very broad sense, that is being provided to them. And they've been doing a little bit of work throughout their life, or a bit of clever investment here and there, and they get these huge bits of money. But most of it is social. It's social wealth. And what is being done, it looks like taxation, but in fact, it looks like redistribution, but in fact, it's what the basic income does is a distribution of this wealth that looks like redistribution, but is in fact distribution like in Spain or like in Alaska. It's simply that it's just natural resources, but all the social resources that we owe to the past. And so that's a sort of ethical reply to your question. On the second thing in Hayek, in our book we have we looked in fact carefully at the various formulations in Hayek in law, legislation, liberty, and also other texts which are less known, and there is a big difference in the attitude towards the idea of a guaranteed minimum income between Friedman and Hayek. Friedman was far more precise in what he was proposing, but far more, I would say, contingent in his justification for it. He says we must have, it would be better in fact if we could just have private charity. But we need to have something because we've had this silly welfare system which has created all these situations of dependency among the poor. So we have an obligation towards the poor because of the mess we've put them in through our silly welfare system. And our obligation will be best discharged through a more rational system, namely a negative income tax. So we had a precise proposal, but a sort of very contingent justification. Hayek never makes a precise proposal, but he has a fundamental justification. He says, in a free society, there must be a minimum guarantee to everyone outside of the market. It's not for the market to provide it, so you shouldn't start fiddling with wages and minimum wages and all these things in order to make sure everyone gets or subsidize wages or do things. No, you need to have something that's outside of the market. What he says is compatible with the basic income, but he explicitly says, well, I'm not going to specify. There may be various considerations that would matter in the design of the operation. But he's for reasons of principle, is in favor of some form of income guarantee. Nothing in his writing said it should be individual and that it shouldn't that it should be universal. But certainly there is the idea that you should be available on the labor market to have enough to survive is it seems to be excluded by his formulation. But we really sort of have been looking carefully at the various formulations in. Then, yes, difficult question about migration. It's in our last chapter, the question of migration is central. There is no doubt that it would be easier to introduce a basic income if you have a closed society with no one leaving the country, no one exporting capital out of the country, and no one coming in or threatening to come in. And so there's basic income is like any non-contributory system of material security is threatened both by selective emigration of the juicy taxpayers and of the corporations and of capital, and by selective immigration of the people who are in immediate sense or even in a long-term sense beneficiaries, would be beneficiaries of the system. So ethically speaking, so I'm in favor of, and I think the only thing that can be defended in today's world is global distributive justice. Borders are contingent, purely arbitrary in ethical terms, but indispensable if you want to have a system that's not completely vulnerable to selective immigration. This is a very old problem. It applies not only to basic income, also to social assistance. In the De Subventione Pauperum, 1526, Vives asks, what do you do with the poor that come from outside of your town? And he says, send them back to your villages, to their villages, but give them a viaticum, something to eat on the way, because otherwise they'll steal on the way. But you are responsible only for your own poor. Except, he says, if there is war in their towns and their villages, then you have to regard them as if they were your own citizens. This is the Geneva Convention avant la lettre, right? And he said, no matter, he says, it's an interesting passage which I'd like to quote in Belgium, he said, it doesn't matter whether they are Jews or Greeks, whether they are Scots or Englishmen, whether they are Flemings or Walloons. So it's anyway. So that's any and when the thing was taken to the religious court, the Ypres scheme. Some of the theologians said, yes, but there is a universal destination of all goods, so you shouldn't exclude them. And then the magistrates of Ypres said, yes, but if we open it to everyone around it, we might as well sort of pack up and end our system. If you say all the poor from the whole of Flanders can come to Ypres when we give them generously, this won't work. And then the theologians could see that there was a pragmatic case there, and they said, okay, but at least the people who come from the neighboring villages you have to take in, and so you have to do compromise. It's messy, and I think in today's world it remains messy. You cannot have, maintain the sort of social assistance systems we have in our European countries without putting limits even to intra-European migration. So there have been several cases in the European Court of Justice about people who migrate not to get a job, but who migrate without previous link to a particular country with the imputed intention of being welfare tourists, and so there were some restrictions, and it's particularly tricky in the case of basic income, because people can come to work, but to work in a little Turkish shop, say half-time with a very low income, they would have a basic income. They would be net beneficiaries of the system. They'll pay less in tax than they receive in basic income. So even if you restrict the migration to workers, you may have a significant drain, at least in the immediate sense, on the local resources. So you'll need any system of social protection that is non-contributory, not social insurance, and that is more generous than what people can get in the surroundings, must protect itself. And the people from outside don't come in order to benefit, they come in order to work, but they may be through work, because they get also basic income through work, beneficiaries of the system. And of course you need to extend the right to basic income to all the fiscal residents of a country. We can't restrict it to the citizens of the country. So that there was in this speech by the PAM bloke, which I watched yesterday, it said for all Mexicans and the basic income. But I think it's very important. It should be for all people who are permanent residents of the country. Of course, the proportion of immigrants in Mexico is far less than in a standard European country. But this is, and so it will always be messy. It will only stop being messy when inequalities worldwide will be a very small fraction of what they are now. We must fight for that, struggle for that, but it's not for tomorrow. Then yes, Camilo, the question, yes, it's, there is, and I'm sure Pablo also, we had one of our congresses in Vienne, which was called, I think it was the Geneva one, Basic Income as a Human Right. I don't object to that, because I think there are bad arguments for good ideas, for which there can be some toleration, but not for too long, and not in all contexts. And in some, and I think it has, and it appeals to some people, and it helps some people take the idea seriously. And then when you scrutinize it a bit, it doesn't hold. But there are contexts in which it plays a negative role. I remember once I had a discussion with Pierre Rosan Vallon, so one of the main most influential French intellectuals, and then suddenly he sort of got more relaxed about it. It was with him and Robert Castel at the time, and both opposed to basic income. But then suddenly he said, yes, so you are not proposing it as a right, but as a social policy. You made that sort of distinction. It's a bit of a weird distinction, but then suddenly he said, then I might consider it. Because then suddenly it was a question of what was the most efficient way of achieving certain objectives, and then suddenly he sort of felt a bit more décontracté, so about he could sort of, whereas if it was asserted as a right, then it seemed to have some sort of, to trump a number of other considerations and no longer be part of the discussion about the efficiency of policy. So it may work both ways. Some people prefer to say, well, and in the basic income movement, among basic income enthusiasts, there are many people who like this idea of being a fundamental right and so on, but I don't think, well, that's, there's no general answer about which one is the most convincing. It depends on the audience you talk to, and in the long run, I think we should concentrate on good arguments for good ideas. And then finally, yes, Pablo, I think in a way the most basic challenge we have in today's world is that, certainly in the European context, but that holds worldwide, is we used to have either as a reality to a large extent or as an ambition, this idea that we gradually strengthen our democracies, we make our polities more democratic, and these democracies then regulate, including in terms of distribution of resources, the market that is an important instrument in terms of dynamic and static economic efficiency, and the democracy imposes its rules on the market. But we've gradually been moving in Europe because of the single market, but massively throughout the world because of so-called globalization, some aspects of so-called globalization, to a situation in which now you have the democracies that compete with each other, are immersed in the market, and where is the market that imposes its rules on the bureaucracies. And so that the regulation is done by the market, and the democracies have to comply with these regulations. And so that means that in the case of basic income, you are in a situation, it varies also from country to country, where the share of wages or of earnings in general in value added has been decreasing in the last 20 years, 25 years, 15 years, depends on the country. And so one of the legitimate objections of the trade unions, for example, they say, come on, we have these, who are you going to tax? Income tax is increasing, you tax on labor income. And so what that means, this shrinking share of the total pie is going to be taxed in order to give basic income to everyone, including the rentiers and so on, and not just the workers. So, and this, they said, this is unacceptable. But they said, if you fund your basic income with something you go and get in the growing share that goes to profits, or sometimes allegedly to profits, because some are also the high earnings of the bosses of a number of corporations that camouflage their earnings in the form of an income on capital in order to pay less tax. And so that also is hidden in these statistics. Then the trade union said, then we are all for it. But of course, this can only be done, that goes back to my linguistic point at the very beginning, if we manage to have not only institutions, things like CEPAL or the ILO or something, not only these institutions, very important, but weak in terms of the powers they actually have, but far stronger institutions, so more with the sort of powers that the European Union has, or more, in order to have a regulation at a level that's higher than the nation. But for this to happen, we need also something like a social movement. This regulation at the national level, including the welfare states, was not just the product of a clever intellectual like Condorcet or a clever bureaucrat somewhere in Prussia taking that out of a drawer and then implementing. It was the result of struggles and of a movement, and so it went hand in hand with nation building, which happened in a national language, which enabled then the workers and the people to coordinate and mobilize in an efficient way. And in order to get this regulation at a high level, at the EU level, at the world level, you need something like an efficient, broader movement that really put pressure. Hence, I mean, this very pedestrian aspect also of improving communication, thanks to the internet, but also thanks to sharing a language. But I fully agree with you that we've lost this grip on the wealth of a country, on the value added of the country, or much of this grip, and we need to regain it. But this regaining will not happen at the national level, and we must do things at a high level in order to give also to each of the national levels a better grip. And so this is a huge challenge. And of course, a viable and generous basic income in every country is dependent also on what is being done at that level. I fully agree with that.
Thank you very much, Philip, for this wonderful talk. And what first?